HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Enslaved Native Americans and the Making of Colonial South Carolina by D. Andrew Johnson, read by Joshua Saxon. Publisher's note. In this audio edition, you will hear references to figures and appendices present in the print and ebook formats of the book. A note on language. Important terms used in scholarly discourse are too often imprecise. I have therefore chosen to define some central terms I use in this work. First, I avoid the term slave because it attributes a passive inevitability to the victim's social status. Instead, I prefer to describe people as enslaved, which places more emphasis on deliberate actions that had to be constantly reinforced by the colonists claiming to own other human beings. I define slaver and slaving to mean those who captured people and/or traded them into systems in which they were ultimately enslaved. I believe that there is a difference, however, between being a captive or being held in captivity and being enslaved. Someone who is captured is a captive. Someone who is being held captive for the purpose of forced labor is enslaved, especially if they are conceptualized by their oppressors as being property. Almost all the captives documented in this book ended up enslaved, but some were also subjected to other infringements on their liberty, such as being held for ransom. Another reason I have decided to use this terminology is that I have seen a discrepancy in the use of language between the literature on Native American enslavement and the literature on the transatlantic slave trade of peoples from Africa. Scholars of transatlantic enslavement typically describe forced migrants as enslaved people, while scholars of Native American enslavement often call analogous victims in the Americas captives. I want to use a single terminology since this work discusses enslavement in the Americas as well as transatlantic enslavement from various ports in Africa. Practically speaking, this means that although this solution is far from ideal, whenever enslavers were bringing people to Charlestown in what is now South Carolina, as it were into the European colonial project, they were captives, while when they were living and working on plantations, they had been enslaved. One of my analytical rubrics is the way colonists in South Carolina racialized enslaved people in documentary records. There are problems with assuming the ethnocultural background of enslaved people in this manner. I acknowledge that by accepting the racial discourse of colonists, I am also reifying the colonial discourse on human difference. I have decided to use this racialized discourse because although race has always been a contested category, it proves useful when considering the perceived ethnocultural distinctions among enslaved peoples. This approach is particularly relevant due to the colonists' deliberate use of race, driven by specific reasons, and due to the existing ethnocultural differences among enslaved people in early South Carolina. Hopefully, scholars in the future will be able to decolonize this discourse and move closer to understanding the ways enslaved people in early South Carolina thought about their own histories and cultures. When I use racial terms, I want the listener to understand what I mean. Whenever I talk about enslaved peoples who were brought to Carolina via transatlantic slaving, I mean enslaved people of African descent whose descendants today are identified as black and have a shared African and Middle Passage past. These people were most often racialized by white colonists as Negro. Because my definition would be long and inelegant in the text of this work, I rely on the shorthand terms of black, African, and Afro-Caribbean. Likewise, when I discuss enslaved peoples who were indigenous to the Americas, whom we now understand as Native American, and who have a shared history of dispossession and enslavement and were racialized as Indian, my shorthand terms are Native, Native American, and Indigenous. I use more precise ethnonyms whenever possible, but those instances are much rarer than I would like. Most of the ethnonyms I use in this work are Native American. Another language choice I have made is to refer to the Native American agricultural practice that planters forced enslaved peoples to implement on plantations in South Carolina as the maize and peas complex. This is for a couple of reasons. First, I conceive of this agricultural strategy and practice as a set of crops and methods for growing them that South Carolina planters appropriated from an array of Native American cultures, hence a complex. I use maize instead of corn because in the period under study, corn meant grain unless it was called Indian corn. Some of the primary sources I quote use corn as a generic term. I therefore use maize in order to be more specific. I used the term peas because it was what European colonists called the various legumes that Native Americans and colonists grew. It is a vague term, and I still have many questions about the strains of peas they grew. The phrase maize and peas complex thus describes both the crops and the intercropping methods that Native Americans and European colonists used to grow them. Whenever I refer to pounds in this work, I am referring, unless I indicate otherwise, to South Carolina colonial pounds, which were always worth less than English or British pounds sterling. Finally, I have standardized dates according to the Gregorian calendar to avoid chronological confusion. 3 dating conventions were used during most of the period under consideration. The Julian calendar, with March 25th as the first day of the year, the Gregorian calendar, with January 1st starting the year, and a combination of the two, with the dates between January 1st and March 25th written as both years. Introduction. The year 1739 was a tumultuous one in South Carolina. In early September, a group of enslaved men began plundering and burning plantations and stores and killing their white colonial oppressors along the main southern road that ran parallel to the Stono River. Their goal, like that of many enslaved people fleeing colonial captivity in Carolina, was to reach Spanish Florida, where they could possibly obtain their freedom. The backlash from this outburst of anti-colonial violence that we have come to know as the Stono Rebellion was swift and fierce. After a battle between the insurgents and the colonial militia near a crossing of the Edisto River, the dispersed freedom seekers were summarily rounded up, interrogated, and tortured. Most were subsequently executed in the name of maintaining a social order that treated captive people as property. A few survivors were sold to other colonies. The white colonists who claimed ownership of the executed rebels were compensated by the state for their loss of property. The terror that white Carolinians felt in the aftermath of the rebellion was internalized and channeled into the infamous 1740 South Carolina Slave Code, which ultimately became the basis of the laws governing slavery in most of the states that seceded from the Union in 1861. In September 1739, white Carolinians saw the Stono insurrection as an existential threat. They considered it a real possibility that the colony's white minority could be murdered and the social order overturned by the very people they had violently oppressed in the name of profit. Most enslaved people probably saw the insurgency as a cautionary tale, showing them just what the risks were of organizing and rebelling. But to others, chaos must have seemed like an opportunity. 1 month later, Joseph Ragg placed an advertisement in the South Carolina Gazette for 3 enslaved men who had run away from his plantation along Goose Creek. Ragg, one of the most successful merchants, planters, and slavers in South Carolina, waited about a month after the escape to take out the advertisement. 2 of the men, England and Prosper, had run away within a week following the uprising along the Stono. The 3rd man, Prince, waited 3 weeks to join England and Prosper, taking a horse from Ragg to aid in his flight. In many ways, the escape of England, Prosper, and Prince was similar to the actions of countless others who were held in bondage and had chosen to resist their status as chattel property in the colonial era and later. But in another sense, Ragg's advertisement tells a more complicated story than most historical narratives of enslavement in the early Americas have captured. Prosper and Prince were England's sons, and they were described by Ragg as belonging to different racial categories than their father. Ragg described England as a Negro and Prosper and Prince as mustis. All 3 worked in the same skilled trade, bricklaying. Inscribed on the bodies of these men were phenotypical markers understood by Ragg to denote their origin. He believed that these markers signified to other white colonists the common grammatical typologies of human variation, essentially what he perceived as their race. Embedded within Ragg's description of the bodies of England, Prosper, and Prince lies an important story that most histories have overlooked. Ragg and other colonial South Carolinians used the term musti to refer to the child of a Native American and a black person of African or Afro-Caribbean descent. Prosper and Prince were in this way the physical and cultural embodiment of the heterogeneous transcontinental early history of enslavement in South Carolina. A person who was central to the lives of England, Prosper, and Prince was not mentioned in the advertisement: Prosper and Prince's enslaved Native American mother. The presence of enslaved people such as England, Prosper, Prince, and their unnamed mother in early South Carolina forces us to rethink the historical development of enslavement in America. First, it raises questions about Native Americans and slavers. Which colonists claimed to own Native people? Can we say there was a profile of the typical enslaver of Native Americans, and did it change over time? Why did they decide to keep these people for their labor when we know that the vast majority of captive native people were sold by white Carolinians to other colonies? How did native people factor into their enslavers' economic strategies? Since native people were always a minority within the larger population of enslaved Carolinians, what was their geographical distribution within the colony? Did gender or age play a role in enslavers' decisions about owning and exploiting Native Americans? And crucially, what roles did enslaved native people play in the colony's early slave society? Histories of South Carolina and the broader Atlantic world have until recently focused very little attention on the enslavement of native people in European American colonies. And while our understanding of the long history of the enslavement of black people has benefited from a scholarly focus dating to the middle of the 20th century, the study of enslaved native people and the reconstruction of native histories is a more recent trend. Since the turn of the 21st century, however, the scholarly attention being paid to the histories of native enslavement has grown rapidly. In the blink of a scholarly eye, the study of native enslavement in the Americas has come to be one of the most important areas of inquiry in Atlantic and early American history. This book is a part of the broader discussion of how we can understand the enslavement of native people in the Americas, but is also a conscious attempt to bridge the gap between histories of native enslavement and the much more developed literature on African American enslavement and history. As I suspect is often the case, this book arose out of intellectual happenstance. Sometime around 2011, as I was preparing to begin my PhD studies, I was reading broadly in Atlantic and early American history and happened to read two books back to back. Slave Counterpoint, Black Culture in the 18th Century Chesapeake and Low Country, by Philip Morgan, and The Indian Slave Trade, The Rise of the English Empire in the American South, 1670 to 1717, by Alan Gillay. Both are about the enslavement of people in and around colonial Charlestown. Slave Counterpoint also discusses enslavement in and around Virginia, and yet I was unsure how I could reconcile the implications of each. Morgan's magisterial work uses the socio-cultural counterpoints of tobacco plantations in Virginia and rice plantations in Carolina to show how enslaved people created new cultures out of the demands placed on them by their enslavers to maximize agricultural production. Gallay's influential monograph shows how the enslavement of native people in the colonial Southeast was central to the social upheaval among Native Americans, and at the same time, how it served European colonists by allowing enough capital accumulation for colonists to become planters. I quickly realized that I needed to undertake a project linking Gallay's insight into the centrality of the native slaving trade and continued native enslavement in and around Charlestown in early Carolina to the socio-cultural history of enslavement on plantations in the colony. In colonial South Carolina, enslavement forced people from many socio-cultural backgrounds together. Although they would not have thought of themselves as such, we now refer to some of them as Gambians, Angolans, and Ibos, and also as Choctaws, Tuscaroras, Westos, and Creeks, to name but a few groups. They came from Africa and North America, and also from parts of the Caribbean such as Anguilla, Curaçao, and Barbados. These people, forced into daily contact with each other, began to form new social bonds based in part on the shared horror of enslavement. Familial relationships between people of different West African identities on Carolina plantations was commonplace, but so was intermarriage spanning transatlantic origins. Focusing on enslaved native people in South Carolina and placing them in the context of the larger population of enslaved black people raises another set of questions. What did the enslaved peoples of South Carolina look like if we take into account the way white colonists racialized them? How did the intersections of racialization, age, and gender work in terms of demographics? Did the structures of the various trades and captives via the Middle Passage, other colonies, and the North American trade in indigenous captives play into the ethno-cultural makeup of the enslaved population of South Carolina? How and when did the term Negro become conflated with and shorthand for slave? What happened to the enslaved native people and their children, racialized as Indian or Musti, by the era of the American Revolution? The delineation of enslaved people as Indian or Musti almost completely vanished from the archive. But was that because they did not survive, or did it have more to do with the changing white ideology of race and slavery? Finally, what did their presence on these plantations mean for the formation of a new culture of the enslaved, in this context, creolization? This is a story about the ramifications flowing from white colonists' changing ideas about plantation management and the economics of the captive native trade. It's a story about white colonists in the Low Country searching for a profitable economic regime and employing the resources they could muster in their search. It's about the long-standing connection between Native American enslavement and agricultural production in the colony. But it's also about the origins of the social pathology that has reverberated through Anglo-American history since its inception. The eventual conflation of the social status slave with the racial status black. And in the end, it is about the histories of enslaved Native people who lived and died on South Carolina plantations, but who have been left out of our histories for far too long. This is a history of the way racial categories were re-encoded by white colonists over time so the realities that were present in South Carolina aligned with their hardening binary racial hierarchy. In order to serve displacive colonial ideologies, the presence of Native people in the colony, particularly as enslaved members of the subaltern community, had to be eliminated in the imagination of the colonists and a binary social hierarchy created: black-white, slave-free. This was in spite of the existing socio-cultural milieu, as in that the social makeup of the colony did not map onto a binary hierarchy because of all the Native people. By the middle of the 18th century, documents such as probate inventory lists shifted from listing individual slaves with a racialized identity for each to listing names of people under the heading Negroes. Of course, the people who were enslaved by white colonists and who were Native or Native descended understood themselves better than the white colonists who scribbled descriptions of them according to a binary racial order. This is a history of violence and dispossession, a history that has been continually reinscribed to the present day. Much scholarly work has been done on the violence of enslavement at the nexus of capitalism and colonialism, and this work adds to that literature. It is also a history of discursive violence. It is a history of the making of race in early America. It is the story of the erasure of Native enslavement on Carolina plantations, which in effect streamlined the colonial social order. While whiteness became defined by freedom, blackness became defined by enslavement, and colonists did not have to account for the intellectual problems that would arise to the colonial project from the presence of Native people enslaved on plantations. Although this book is concerned with all Native people as enslaved laborers on early Carolina plantations, it focuses most on Native women. This is because Native women and children, due to the structures of enslavement in America, made up the majority of the enslaved Native population, and because colonial planters came to realize that Native women were valuable to their plantation strategies. My focus on the importance of Native women in the colonial Southeast aligns with the historiographical trend of scholars uncovering how Native women were central to the colonial world. This history, according to Alejandro Dubkovsky, undermines a common assumption that control over Native women was so complete as to render them irrelevant to the structures and processes that shaped the colonial world. This book reveals that the same can be said about their importance to early Carolina plantations. Ultimately, this is a history about the centrality and importance of the exploitation of Native women, and to a lesser extent Native men, their knowledge, their work, their bodies, in the construction of early South Carolina. It is a story that follows Native people's ideas about gender and how those ideas were turned into the tools of their oppression. It is about how European men realized they could coerce Native women and their agricultural technology toward their own ends. Commercial profit through transatlantic trade. This book argues that enslaved Native people transformed the South Carolina economy and made plantation slavery and commercial rice agriculture possible. The vast fortunes accumulated by low-country planters by the time of the American Revolution were built not only on rice and indigo, but even more fundamentally on the maize and peas complex. The founding of the colony of Carolina was always intended as a displacive settler colonial project. Europeans wanted to move into the Low Country, and they wanted Native peoples to stay out of their way. By 1670, the English had given up on conquering large hierarchical indigenous societies such as the Aztecs and Incas that the Spanish had managed to subjugate more than a century earlier. Large numbers of native laborers living under coercive regimes were not to be found in the areas of the Americas left open after colonization by the Spanish and Portuguese. Put another way, the English had no chance at conquest in the Americas. They could only colonize. English colonialism, therefore, was of a different type. Whereas the Spaniards' colonialism in a broad sense either was centered on the riches they could extract from conquered indigenous peoples, or colonies that extracted labor from indigenous peoples, The English and French and Dutch had no similar opportunities in the Americas. Instead, the English set about displacing native political units and setting up Proto-European societies. These colonies could be an outlet for rising European populations, people deemed undesirable by state actors, and even younger male children of the gentry, who had little opportunity to succeed their fathers in a late feudal landed system based on primogeniture. Incipient colonial projects offered infinite possibilities. Many of the possibilities were terrifying, but others were attractive. One intractable problem always remained, though: labor. The English, for the most part, gave up on the coercion of large numbers of indigenous people as a business strategy, not because of any moral objection, but instead due to the impracticality of capturing and controlling large populations of natives who were organized into small decentralized political units. The preferred strategy many English colonists in Carolina, and to differing degrees in other locales as well, settled on for wealth accumulation was selling native captives into Atlantic commercial circuits. But between the great reduction in the population of native people due to disease, warfare, and enslavement brought on by European colonization, and native people's defensive adaptations to these overlapping crises, seizing captives for the slave trade in the Southeast became more difficult by the early 18th century. White colonists thus not only over time expelled native people from lands they wanted to appropriate, but also slowly began conflating the terms slave and Negro, thereby bifurcating the racial order within the colony by eliminating native people from the ranks of the enslaved at a conceptual level. In the parlance of settler colonial theory, Native Americans had to be considered an indigenous other by colonists, and then either expelled or reimagined as a different people in order for Europeans to lay claim to the land they had no right to. The other in this formulation, black enslaved peoples, being exogenous, could be part of the colonial project because they had no claim to the land. One goal of this book is to outline how the quandary facing white colonists was eventually reconciled. How could people whose labor and expertise they came to understand as beneficial to their colonial cause, indigenous Americans, coexist with displacive colonial ideas about the elimination of natives from colonial spaces? The short answer is that enslaved native people and their descendants were eventually recoded by white colonists as Negro. But over time, the cultural distinctions between individual enslaved people narrowed, and peoples who had originated in different parts of the world, from West and West Central Africa, North America, the Caribbean, and even a few from East India, forged a new culture out of their histories, experiences, and circumstances. In a sense, then, enslaved Native Americans became interwoven with enslaved black peoples in Carolina, and were therefore full members of the Creole enslaved community. So although white colonists' racialization of enslaved peoples and their flattening of the multitude of cultures represented in the enslaved community was done as an act of discursive violence, enslaved peoples used their shared experiences under chattel bondage to reappropriate their oppressors' racial classifications as markers for their own communities. This study is interdisciplinary and follows multiple threads. The structure is for the most part chronological, but there are temporal digressions for added context. The book contains myriad arguments about early colonial South Carolina, the people who lived there, both white colonists and the enslaved, and the broader Atlantic world they navigated. But 5 overarching arguments predominate. First, enslaved Native Americans mattered, and not simply as an act of historical recovery. Enslaved Native American women were especially important to the social, cultural, and economic development of the colonial spaces of Carolina. Second, tracing the history of enslaved Native peoples shows us a crucial component of the history of plantation management. By the 18th century, many white planters actively constructed their coerced labor force to include Native Americans, and they appropriated Native ideas about gender and labor in order to profit. Third, there was a connection between food production and Native enslavement from the very beginnings of Carolina. This connection continued through at least the middle of the 18th century. Fourth, taking enslaved Native Americans into account changes how we should think about the social history and development of enslavement. Our ideas about the social history of enslaved people in Carolina lack perspective on Native peoples' important socio-cultural inputs in the complex crucible of creolization. Enslaved natives were a significant group who, like all enslaved people, took an active role in forging a new culture from the building blocks of an array of old ones. And fifth, by tracing the history of enslaved Native people in the Low Country, we can see the collapsing of racial categories in 18th century South Carolina. It happened at different times elsewhere. The conflation of Negro and slave. Until the mid-18th century, white colonists continued to differentiate enslaved peoples by the racial categories Negro, Indian, Musti, and mulatto. After the period under study, enslaved people who would previously have been racialized as Indian or Musti became Negro in the imagination of white colonists. But enslaved people and their descendants remembered their native ancestry long after colonists' archival records erased it. Chapter 1 discusses the years before the permanent founding of Carolina in 1670. Its central concern is what the people in Carolina during the early 1670s would have known about the enslavement of native peoples in the Americas. But native people had ideas about the European enslavement of indigenous Americans too. Some native people had lived through English slaving in modern North Carolina. Some people from the Low Country even visited Barbados, the center of English plantation production during the 1660s, and made it back home to Carolina to tell of it. Chapter 2 is a study of the 1670s. In many ways, this decade was crucial to the history of the Southeast and Carolina, but studies of Carolina often flatten this formative era. Historians often focus on later periods that have more robust source bases. During this period, a direct connection between food production and the enslavement of native peoples was forged, and it therefore deserves close inspection. Troubles with food production and supply led colonists to depend on native people for their sustenance, which in turn drove some native people's resentment of the colony. This dynamic led to violence, which led to colonists taking captives, most of whom would have known how to grow the maize and peas complex. Chapter 3 begins tracing the rise of the maize and peas complex. Much of the chapter concentrates on the export production problems white colonists faced in their decisions to enslave native people as a solution. The trade in enslaved people led to an acceleration in the accumulation of capital for the colonists who decided to partake in the brutal business. Farming maize and peas was a practical strategy some colonists adopted to produce nutritious foodstuffs with low labor requirements. Colonists endured an array of crises but cared little what the impartial metropole thought of their economic activities so long as profit was made. Chapter 4 discusses the period between 1700 and the 1715 war against the colony by the indigenous people of the region. This era was the height of the enslavement of native peoples in and around Charlestown, but it was also when the trade collapsed. The chapter traces the expansion of the maize and peas complex and affords a better view of the socio-spatial dynamics of enslavement. During these years, planting rice became the main economic strategy of colonists who had been successful enslavers. It was no coincidence that slavers living inland, with access to both native and African captives, were the first Europeans to successfully develop rice as an export commodity. Chapter 5 follows the continued presence of enslaved Native Americans on plantations during the years when massive numbers of enslaved black people were imported up to the Stoner Rebellion. It outlines the demographic decline of enslaved people who were racialized as Indians, though numbers of them certainly remained. They did not disappear after the collapse of the native slaving trade, though their presence becomes increasingly opaque to us in the documentary record. We can also follow the maize and peas complex onto plantations that did not have any people racialized as Indian. By this time, rice cultivation was hegemonic, but the knowledge and labor appropriated from enslaved Native Americans were still important to white planters. Chapter 6 attempts to trace an outline of the biography of an enslaved Tuscarora woman named Nanny by her oppressor. The archival silences pertaining to enslaved Native people in South Carolina are limiting in many ways. But this chapter aims to demonstrate that their stories can be recovered. It also uses archaeological evidence to discuss the cultural history of the enslaved by pointing out patterns in one type of colonial-ware pottery found at numerous plantation sites in the Low Country. This work is just the beginning of what needs to be done for us to understand the role of enslaved Native Americans on colonial plantations in North America. Long overlooked by scholars, enslaved Native people have become an important topic of study in early American and Atlantic histories. As much as anything else, my goal in this book is to point toward other fruitful areas of inquiry so that we can gain a better grasp of the connected histories of colonialism, enslavement, and capitalism. Chapter 1. Before Carolina. George was sold to the father-in-law of his oppressor. In about 1654, Richard Norwood, a former schoolmaster, gave £20 sterling to James Widder, who was married to his daughter Elizabeth. This
Sample complete. Ready to continue?